Hey everybody, this is Joe Miller from the Toyota 4x4 podcast. At least that's what I'm hoping I'm going to call it. I'm in a car driving by myself and was listening to some other 4x4 podcasts, and I just didn't really like them. So I thought I would start off a Toyota 4x4 podcast, and this is the first one. I'm just driving by myself, and I got some really cool ideas. We'll see if anyone listens, but I tried to search for Toyota 4x4 podcast and came up with nothing, so I figured I would start something. As far as the Toyota 4x4 world, I just feel like we're a little bit of a different breed. You know, most of the Toyota owners that I come in contact with, a lot of times we're kind of on the same line. Not that there's anything wrong with any other brands, but there's just something different about the Toyota 4x4 world. And I think it's something worth talking about, and in this episode, I'll kind of just ramble on about my background with Toyotas and how I got into wheeling. I'm 35, I think. Yeah, I'm either 35 or 36. I was born in 1982. Yeah, I'm getting old. I got 2 kids. That's why I can't remember how old I am. But I got started wheeling, I think, when... I was very first married to my first wife, I think around 2004. She actually had a 87 Toyota pickup truck, and that was my first exposure to really 4x4ing. I was interested in it in high school. I wanted a Jeep Cherokee or a Suzuki Samurai. I never ended up getting it. And anyways, ended up going on my first camping trip with the Toyota 4x4, and just kind of fell in love. You know, I don't know, those of you out there, if you remember your first time actually off-roading, like really getting off pavement. And it's funny to look back on how exciting it was to just kind of go through cross ditches and just get a little off camber. Super, super exciting. And I think that's when everyone catches that bug. Anyone that's just been used to driving on the street, it's pretty exhilarating to go off-road and see what a 4x4 can do. And that's how it all started. So an 87 Toyota pickup. I started reading a bunch, got into pirate4x4.com and just would read all the build threads on everything. And I think the reason that I fell in love with Toyotas was because it required some form of fabricating knowledge. Like, I got into it when I was in college and I had no money, and everything that I had read had said that Toyotas were pretty well built, and not really knowing anything, I experienced that with that 87 Toyota pickup. I was, pretty surprised at where it would go, and it fit 31s without any lift, and it was a legit truck. It was good on gas and just all around pretty amazing. And I fell in love with that. I think how do you not fall in love with a reliable vehicle that's, older, that does everything you ask of it? I mean, that's why it was amazing. Jeeps, I just, early on in my experience, I think I just kind of kicked them to the curb, because in my early off-roading events, it just seemed like they were always broken. And it seemed like my, independent front suspension 87 Toyota pickup truck was more reliable than these brand new Jeeps, and I kind of thought that was ridiculous. And it was nice on the pocketbook. So I started reading a whole ton, and the bug catches you, and then you want to go further and go more places, and that required me making modifications. And I think what happens with the Toyota crowd is a lot of people have, an 86 and up Toyota pickup, not with a solid front axle, and you kind of max out your capabilities, which I have to say, a rear locker in an IFS Toyota pickup will get you so many places, but you do get to a point where you start to get a little frustrated with the beating that the IFS takes, and putting wheels up in the air and not getting the traction that you want. And inevitably what happens is the solid axle swap comes into play, or getting a solid axle. You start to realize how important that actually is. And that's what happened to me. I think it's a natural evolution. You do the IFS thing for a little bit, you run your 31s for a while, you throw a locker in the back, and then you kind of max out and you see everyone doing all these other trails, and you want to do more. And that's what happened to me. I learned that having a solid front axle was really important for articulation and to be able to keep traction on the ground. So I kept my eye out for an 85 Toyota pickup and ended up coming across an 85 Toyota pickup, long box, regular cab. And that was my first truck. So I bought it for, I think, $2,000 or $2,500. Pretty funny story. When I showed up, I was, in my early 20s, didn't really know too much. I drove to the guy's place and looked at it. There's a little bit of rust on the frame. But it was, back then, this is like early 2000s, it wasn't, like, solid axle swaps weren't super, super common. And as a noob, it was a lot easier for me to find an already, solid axle truck. So I was looking for the 85 that already had a factory solid front axle. And the rust on the frame was really problematic and common in the Pacific Northwest. I was in Vancouver, Canada. And I ended up getting one, showed up, cash in hand, and told the guy that I was going to take it. I had a quick peek around, not really knowing much. I did see a little bit of rust, but wanted it anyways. Cab was mint, the box was mint, and ended up getting a pretty good deal on it, but I had to run to the bank and get some cash. So I ran to the bank, pulled my cash. Sorry, I didn't have cash in hand. I ended up coming back and paid the guy the money. And as I was paying the guy the money, there was a built 4Runner that came coming in, like literally as I was driving away. That's it. I did have cash in hand, and we went and got the insurance papers, and then I came back, and as I was driving away, what had actually happened, because I called the guy, because there's a guy that like came out and started talking to the guy as I was driving away that I bought it from. And so I called him, and what had actually happened was that guy in the 4Runner had showed up and was gonna buy the truck, but he said, "Hey, first come, first serve," and he was kind of kicking his tires and trying to really haggle him down on price. And he said, well, he'll think about it, he'll go to the bank, see if he can get the money. But he didn't commit to buying it. So in the time that guy had left to go to the bank to get the money, I had come with my cash to buy the truck, and we put plates on it and switched the title over to me and insured it, and I was driving it away when that guy showed up. So I totally scooped it, and I remember feeling pretty great about that. But that was my first truck. And then what happened with that was the frame was pretty rotten, and everything I read, I talked to some people, and they said that I really should deal with the frame rust before putting any money into the truck, and that was kind of a bummer. And I called around a bunch of places, some auto wreckers, and I actually did find a really solid frame. And I asked some people how bad a frame swap was, and at that time I was just renting an apartment, so everything, any kind of work that I had to do in my parents' carport, which was half covered, and in the Pacific Northwest it rains a lot, so half covered carport. There were a lot of wet days working on that truck. But I was able to pick up a really like super mint clean frame, 85 pickup frame, that I got shipped to my parents' house for $800, like all said and done, which was a pretty good deal. So I was into it for, I think, like under $3,000 or just over $3,000. And that's really where my journey began. So I just started, picking away. I had never turned a wrench really before. I certainly had no fab skills. That's one of the reasons why I got the frame. And in my parents' carport, it was the most sketchy thing ever. I undid all the body mounts, undid all the brake lines, took off the box, bought an engine hoist so I could lift off the box by myself, rolled it off to the side of my parents' house, and then in super sketchy, true noob form, I had a bottle jack and a floor jack and milk crates, and I just slowly jacked up the cab as high as I could. And this was like on the stock tires, so they were really low. Jacked up the cab as high as I could, and then ran 2x4s on stacked milk crates, like from one end to the other in I think 3 places. So I had like 6 milk crates all around the truck with 3, sets of 2x4s running across the milk crates. And then I rested the cab down on that. And I remember, I actually have some pictures. I should dig them out. I'm pretty sure my photo bucket account still has the photos. But I remember it bowing, like the 2x4s were bowing like really hard, and it was so sketchy. And I ended up dropping. I had to pull the front wheels off in order to get the engine low enough to be able to slide out under the cab. So I did that, and so on a floor jack, I rolled the floor jack under the front axle, and that was rolling as I rolled the entire frame, motor, everything out. Oh, no. Sorry. I got this all mixed up. I disconnected the motor and everything. So the motor, tranny, everything was floating in place with the cab. So I had the engine hoist lifting up the engine and holding the tranny. The tranny was ratchet strapped to the cab, and I just bottle jacked and floor jacked up like incrementally the cab, and then used the engine hoist to lift up the engine all incrementally to get it high enough to then get the bottle jack or the floor jack under the front axle to get the wheels off, and then I rolled it out the back. So rear wheels were still on, and I rolled it out the back. And what was ridiculous about my parents' place where I was building this truck was that it was a carport, and it was like downhill into the carport. So half the carport was covered, and I had to roll the frame out and like then uphill. And it was so sketch, but it worked. Somehow it worked, and somehow I didn't get crushed. I would never recommend it to anyone else, but I think anyone that, kind of didn't know anything or didn't really have family that, was in trades or, any like mechanically inclined has probably done something like this in the beginning. It's just figure out how to make it work, which I also feel like is kind of like Toyota. It's in the Toyota spirit. It's just like figure out how to make it work, get it done, and just get it working. So I pulled it out, and that's actually when I met one of my good friends, Brent. He was, his friend lived down the street, and there was a Toyota pickup down at the bottom of the street, and they had seen what I was doing, and I think Brent actually came and lent a hand rolling that rusty frame up my parents' carport so I could swap it. So that was like my first big project. So I rolled in, I swapped over I did the rear Chevy leaf swap on the frame before, and this was my first experience. So with my wife's truck, my ex-wife's truck, I loaded up the frame that I got into the back of her truck, and I had all the measurements from Pirate 4x4 to weld on the spring hangers. And I had read on the internet to cut off the spring hangers and like measure where I needed to do them. So I measured and marked where I needed the rear spring hangers to go, and like the rear spring hangers that the shackles bolted into on my spare frame. I remember going to the hardware store. I was like, okay, I need to cut some metal, and I was trying to describe to them what I was cutting off, and they ended up sending me out with like a grinding stone. I swear it must have been like a 1/4 inch thick. I don't think I've ever used one of these ever since. It was like a 1/4 inch thick grinding stone and a grinder. That's what I bought. Relying on the hardware store people as the metal fab experts to tell me what to do. And this was really like pre-YouTube. YouTube wasn't like huge, so it was to figure out how to use a cutoff wheel or cut something. It wasn't as easy as just popping it into YouTube and getting a video. So I ended up taking that 1/4-inch grinding stone. I remember in the rain in the backyard, because that's where I kept that frame, trying to grind the stock rear shackle hangers off the frame, and I gouged the frame so bad because I was just such a noob. I had no idea, one, that there were thinner cutoff wheels that I should be using, and I had this 1/4-inch grinding stone, and I was just grinding these welds out, and like I got one off, and it probably took me like 2 or 3 hours to get one side off, and I was like, no, we're done. Like, I'm not doing this. I'm gonna bring it into a fab shop and like trade like free labor or whatever to have them show me how to like cut these off and weld on these like the front spring hangers for the Chevy swap. And so what ended up happening is I threw that frame in the back of my ex-wife's pickup and drove it to the nearest like fab shop. And I can't remember the name. It was like not Northwest Fab, because that still exists. It was like Northwest Fab or something like that. The guy's name was Clint. Anyways, I just literally drove to this fab shop. He had like a fancy Jeep out there on big tires, and I don't even know what it was because I didn't care because it was a Jeep. But I showed up and I had this frame sticking out the back of the long box, which was probably just as long as my long box, like hanging out the back of the bed. And I literally just, I didn't ask this guy anything. I just loaded it up in my truck, and I just showed up at the guy's shop and said, just asked for the owner, and I said, hey, I know nothing about, welding or anything like that, and I need these spring hangers welded on. I have all the measurements, but can I trade you like some labor? Happy to work like over a weekend on any project or like anything, just to like trade you your time in exchange for my inexperienced time, which, looking back on that, probably wasn't that great of a deal. But I think he appreciated the gumption. I had no money because I was in school, and I also didn't know anyone that could have done this for me at the time. So he said, hey man, you know what? Yeah, totally. Bring it on in. So he just said, unload it right there on the spot. And like in my mind, when you talk about metal fab, like when you don't know anything, you think that these things are like these massive projects, and I guess they are, but really once you do them, they really aren't that bad. So we unload the frame, and he's like, yeah, totally, like where do you need them? And he asked me like 100 times, like he's like, are you sure this is where you need these measured? And I was pretty sure, because the Pirate 4x4 Toyota FAQ said that this is where the measurements had to be. So I just said, yeah, like this is where they gotta be. So in like 2 seconds, he like sits there and like zips off the hangers after marking and measuring everything. And my mind is blown because he did it so fast. Like just seeing him cut off the hangers blew my mind after the 3 hours that I had spent trying to get that one rear shackle hanger off, because he had the right tools. He had a zip disc, and he just burned it off super quick. He showed me like how to cut into the welds and not gouge the frame. And so he left me to do all the grinding work to clean up, the welds after the stuff he had cut. So he showed me how to do that. And it's funny because I remember how, like, you don't realize how much weight you need to put into grinding things. Like the more weight you put in, you clean things way faster. So I was so dainty with cutting off my hanger, like with cleaning up the welds that he had cut off, and it was taking forever. And I remember him like he was working as I was off in the corner of his shop doing this. He like comes over, he's like, hey look, like you gotta put your weight into this. Like you can put all your weight into this. The more weight you put into it, the faster material will come off. And It was with a flap disc, and he's like, look, it's gonna be clean. Like, and he showed me like one side did it super quick, and just like that, those little tips helped so much. So then I went over to the other side and, you know, did it a little bit faster, got it all cleaned up. And, you know, knowing nothing about welding, I thought this was gonna be like this huge old process. And he comes and he's like, okay, this is where you need to put them, and he like marks them all up with a clamp. He's got C clamps kind of holding it everywhere in place. He's like, okay, you're sure, like 100% this is where it needs to be? And I'm like, yep. Bzz, bzz, bzz. Weld it all in, done. Throw some paint on. He's like, okay, you're done. I just need you to come hold this. And he was building a roll cage for his Jeep. So the trade was, seriously, I held up his, like a bunch of bent tube for his roll cage in his Jeep while he tacked it all into place. And he was like, you're good, man. He's like, that's like, hopefully it all works out for you. And he sent me on my way. We loaded it back up in the truck. And like in a few hours I had, you know, finished my welding of those hangers for the rear Chevy swap, which was great. So then what I did is I put my rear Chevys on, and I swapped, you know, the axles and everything. So I had a rolling chassis on the new frame, and then rolled that under the super sketch setup and slowly dropped everything back down. And that was my first kind of big epic project. But then right off the bat, I had an 85 Toyota pickup with a solid front axle, and I had Chevys in the rear, which was awesome. So that combo was a pretty sweet setup. And I picked up a canopy for cheap, and that was the beginnings of like my real wheeling. I picked up some 33s. I picked up 33s right off the bat. So I had 410s. I was open. Chevys in the rear, Toyota 85, Toyota pickup, regular cab, long box. It was gray, and I had a red canopy on it. Actually, I poached the red canopy from my ex's truck because she didn't like it. So I put on mine, and then I painted it like a olive drab army green. And that was kind of the beginning of wheeling, like where I now had a solid axle rig that had a decent amount of flex. And that's kind of what started it. It was still push-pull steering. And so the natural evolution, you know, was that the push-pull steering was swapped over for crossover steering. Back then, I found an arm. There was a company called Aqualo, I think. I think they still exist, but they don't do these anymore. What they would do is they would take a passenger side steering arm, and you'd get two of them. One would be flipped down on top of the other one, and then you would weld them together, and then you would put a gusset in between the arms, and that would all be welded. And it was supposed to have been welded like the proper way, but still was super not legit as far as what motor vehicle safety laws would be, I would imagine. But I picked up one of those for cheap, so I got crossover steering with a welded crossover steering arm on the passenger side, so I could run my IFS steering box. And that was the first time that I realized that I had to weld. So I actually was talking to some friends, and this is all like probably over a year. I had my dad's friend had a farm in Alberta, Canada, and he had a buzz box. It was an AC buzz box, so an AC stick welder. And he gave it to me for like, he said, I'll give it to you for $60. It's just sitting in the barn. I don't need it. So next time I'm out, I'll bring it. So he brought it, and it's funny because that my buddy Brent, he was signed up to go to school to start his welding tickets, and you know, I had this AC buzz box, and I got it for the first time, and I was reading online like how to do it, and it was so stinking hard. Like, it would always stick. I had to have it at like the most perfect distance, and I just practiced running beads after beads after beads. I'd take pictures, I'd put them on, you know, our local 4x4 board at that time, which was BC 4x4, which has gone to crap since new owners took over it, kind of like Pirate 4x4. Posted the Pirate 4x4 asking if things were good. Had the 60-11 rod, a 70-18 rod, and played around with those. And I was just running beads after beads after beads, and I spent a lot of time practicing just welding scrap metal together, not really having a clue what I was doing. And it was so hard because I still don't really know much about AC and DC stick welding, but I guess because AC is alternating current, it's like jumping back and forth. So there's it's intermittent, I think. So that's why it's not like this direct flow of current. So that's why it's like on and off and on and off. So that's why it would stick so easily if you weren't in like the perfect distance for welding. Anyways, I practiced so much on it that I got decent at it, decent enough to the point where I built my rock sliders first, and this was still, I had my push-pull steering. I ended up making a rear pack, or maybe there was, like back then you'd buy like these Jeep Wagoneer springs and put them in, and I did that. And I had to have a drop drag link, so my drag link on my push-pull steering, it was like, it's funny because it's so retro looking back on it. It's just classic stuff. So the drag link had like this kink in it to make up for a lift, so you didn't get really weird bump steer. And like that was all put in. I built my rock sliders, so all my practice was building the rock sliders. I built a rear kind of square tube bumper with some square supports that went up from the rear bumper, like up towards the wheels, like underneath the bottom of the bed to protect the bed. And it had a 2-inch hitch receiver in it. Like I made all these bumpers with this AC stick welder, so I got pretty decent at it. And then I did the crossover steering, and I welded the plate onto the frame. Like that was the one that I waited for until I felt like I was decent with this AC buzz box. Plated the frame in the front and did the IFS steering box conversion for my crossover with the arms I was talking about. That was like the last thing that I did to that truck that was like kind of brought it to level where I had crossover steering. I had decently flexy springs in the front. I had the Chevys in the rear, and it was open, and it had kind of gotten to a stage where like it was good. It was good. And I had a friend at a shop just take my 410 gear set and weld it up in the rear, because that was a cheap way to have a locker, and it was amazing. So I ran that for like quite a while, and I did a bunch of runs, like organized a bunch of runs locally, got some 4x4 shops involved to give away prizes, and it was awesome. I wheeled that. I wheeled with a lot of Jeeps, saw a lot of Jeeps break, and I just had like this budget build. What I couldn't believe was like that I was this college kid in business school that knew absolutely nothing about wrenching, and with a Haynes manual online, like for relatively cheap, I was able to actually build a really legit decent wheeler without a whole ton of money. I think the tires I was running were BFG All-Terrains. Those are my 33s I was running. And open. I actually still have the video of kind of my first trip out with that setup, which I'll post at some point. And that's like the very beginnings of my wheeling career, I guess you could say, before things got gnarly. I feel like a Toyota on 33s with 410s with a locker in the rear or a welded diff in the rear and some body armor will get you a lot of places. A lot of places. It'll be super stout, and that was the beginning of my wheeling career. I guess I might as well keep going on the evolution of my truck, and we'll just call this the evolution of Joe's Toyota pickup. At that point, I wheeled that for a long time, and then it was becoming apparent that my departure angle was not that great with the long box that stuck out a whole bunch, and I didn't really have the expertise for at that point. Like I just had an AC buzz box, 220 AC buzz box, so I wasn't doing any body work for sure with that thing. And I sold my box, which was really, really rare. I actually sold the box for $700, which was great. In Vancouver, in BC, getting like a second gen Toyota pickup box is really rare. Like that isn't super rusted out, because the metal sucks for some reason on the boxes and they get rusted out really bad. My box is really clean, so I sold that for $700, and for $500 I picked up a custom flat deck, or a custom deck. It wasn't a flat deck, but it was a custom deck, but it was made for a short box. And so I got that, and looking at my photos back then, it's like the most haggard, ugliest Mad Max gross box ever. I was so excited about it though, because it felt so hardcore. I got that, and then I also got 35s, and I re-geared to 529, so I was welded in the rear. I ended up getting trail gear was kind of out at that point, so I was able to pick up, a real set of steering arms. So I had high steer, and welded rear. I didn't weld the front for a while. So I had this haggard looking Mad Max deck in the back, which I thought was so cool. It had like aluminum checker plate on it, and I just thought it was awesome. But I look back at the pictures now and it was so haggard. It was too short though, so I had to extend it. So that was a little project that I extended and put like a little hitch pin kind of thing. I don't even know what it's called. You'll realize that my terminology really blows. Like some kind of hitch pin something or other. And it's like a spring thing, like spring loaded pin, I guess you could call it. So I made this sweet little tailgate for that box, and then that's when I was like pretty confident with my metal fabbing skills. Like I was getting more and more confident, and then I saved up. Actually, probably this whole truck build was funded with my student loans. So I did end up buying chop saw and JD Squared tube bender and Bentech Pro bending software, and I mounted this bender at a place we were renting, and I bent up an EXO after that. And I didn't want to. I remember I didn't want to do hydro assist in the front, and I didn't want to. I didn't want to winch, and I didn't want to weld my front diff until I had an EXO, because I had kind of watched a whole bunch of other people completely destroy their vehicles because they went locked front and rear before they had the required body armor. And this was my daily driver vehicle, so that's the reason why I wanted to EXO it, was so that it didn't get super raisined and become a heat score for the police, because I had to use it every day. So I ended up getting a tube bender. Bentech Pro was amazing. Like I knew nothing about bending or fabricating like roll cages or anything like that, and I just plugged it all. It took all the measurements, plugged it all into the software, and then I bent it all up, and it was awesome. Like I hardly had any waste, and bent it all up. And I think at that point I had probably built the welder I have now, which was a Lincoln MigPack 180. And what's funny back then is like everyone was saying go Miller, which is like $1,500 machine. And then like a store up here called Canadian Tire hardware store here had this MigPack, I think it's MigPack 180, for like on sale for $500. I was like, man, like $500 versus getting this Miller. And I had all these people like, oh, Miller's the best, like it's the best way to go, blah blah, like just really hyping on this welder that was $1,500 versus the $500 Canadian Tire model. And I've had that. I still have that welder, and it had no bottle on it. It was just flux core, and that's like that's the welder that got me through like all of my early fabbing. Like I didn't even convert it over to gas, which is actually another funny story, till like 2 or 3 years ago. But I had this flux core MIG welder and it was perfect. It was like, it did everything. So I welded up my EXO with that. And then I ended up getting a mile marker winch because that was cheap. It's funny how cheap winches are now, but I had a mile marker winch. I think I paid $400 for it, and that was cheap because any of like the Warren M8000 was like $800 or $900 back then. And I built my front. Oh yeah, I built my front bumper first before I did my EXO. That was a project I was super stoked about because I built it out of C channel, and it looked legit. Like I made an actual legit looking bumper. I should do a post on that too, because that was impressive. I just took C channel, cut it down with a zip disc, and just kind of formed it and used 1/4 inch flat bar to kind of put angles on it and make it look like a real bumper. And that was legit. I'd say that was my first like epic fab project, was my front winch bumper. Anyways, built the EXO, connected it into that front bumper, and then I had a buddy weld the front diff, threw that in, and then I got Longfields, like the real longs, chromoly front axle shafts. I was running Smurfields. I'm not sure if anyone knows what those are. I'll probably do another post about that. I would love to track down the Travis Rankin. He was like famous for making Smurfields, essentially making a stock Toyota Burfield a lot stronger and handle 35s like respectably, amazingly actually. Another post about that. So I had those, and then I ended up doing longs. Yeah, I had those on 35s. I remember hunting down Travis Rankin to take my stock Burfs and turn them into Smurfields for $40 a piece. And that was like a lot of money to me back then after buying that winch. I remember that. But I wanted to be safe and strong. So at that point I had my EXO. I had my Mad Max looking funky rear box. I had the Trail Gear skid plate. But before that, no, at that point I made like this super ghetto 1/4 inch plate cover for the dual cases. So I had dual cases, 35s, Trucks Mud Trains, which were an awesome street / wheeling tire. I really liked those. I had my mile marker winch, EXO ugly box, and yeah, I remember because I was going to go wheel this trail called Fucked. And I was really worried it was going to totally destroy my T-case and my dual cases, because I had the dual cases set up and it was on my stock cross member. So it stuck out, like it was just wide open, and this trail was like pretty gnarly. I was building my truck to go wheel this trail called Fucked, which was like a pretty new trail at that point, and I had walked it before it was ever cleared. And that's actually what motivated me to get all this stuff done on my truck, because I wanted to do this like hardcore trail and, you know, build my truck to be able to do that. And so I actually took the stock cross member off, and I cut a bunch of like 3-inch by 1/4 flat bar into lengths and welded them together with angles on the ends of them. And then I notched out the stock cross member and slid all of that, like this essentially big plate that I created, I slid that into the stock cross member, notched it out so it would slide through there, and then welded it all up around the edges. So it was the stock cross member with this big like wing sticking out the back that covered my dual cases, and that was kind of how I ran that for a while until I could afford the Trail Gear cross member. I remember that. Oh, this is good times thinking about these. Anyways, that I got my truck built up, exos, 35s, welded front and rear. Oh yeah, I did the hydro assist also, but I just bought the hydro assist ram kit from Trail Gear, and then I extended I just cut the stock power steering reservoir and welded in a piece of muffler to make it a bigger reservoir, which worked mint, and then I drilled out the restrictor plate on the power steering pump to get me some speed on the hydro assist, and that actually worked money. Like right now I'm running a high pressure power steering pump, and honestly I don't feel much of a difference between that and drilling out the stock power steering pump restrictor plate with a welded front diff. More on that later. But that's what I ran. It was awesome. And then I went and I took that truck and I ran it through Fucked, and it did freaking phenomenal. Like this was the hardcore trail in the area back then, way harder back then than it is now, and stomped it, absolutely stomped it, and did really, really well. I think I winched once because I blew a bead, but we had ether and we just seated the bead on and it was fine. But that was like that was my delve into like, I don't want to call it real wheeling, but like real legit wheeling. And I would say real legit wheeling as in like, in my opinion, wheeling isn't wheeling unless like it requires you to be locked front and rear. That's just my opinion. You know, it's cool to go out and do stuff, but like as far as this podcast goes, and you know, Toyota 4x4s and Toyota rock crawling, if you can, unless it requires you to be locked front and rear, it's not real wheeling in my opinion. Like it's like, we'll call it overlanding. It's like exploring or a decent trail. Any trail that requires you to be locked front and rear to me is like legit wheeling. And that's the kind of wheeling that I was into. I wanted to be able to get to the places, to get to the lakes, to get to those destinations that required you to have front and rear lockers and have a winch, because you would probably need to use it. Like that was the level that I was into. So when I built my truck to that stage to be able to go wheel that kind of a trail, that's what really, it was kind of the pinnacle of my wheeling experience. And I don't know if there are any listeners that like remember getting to that stage, and I don't want to sound elitist or anything like that, but there definitely is this level of wheeling. Like when I listen to some of these other podcasts, and as soon as I hear someone say like, oh yeah, like, you know, I have 5 years of wheeling experience, and you know, I'm not locked front and rear, and I have a Jeep Dana 30 in the front, I'm too scared to break the pinion. Like that to me is like, that's cool, no disrespect at all, but it's not my jam. Like when you go out wheeling, you want it, like, yeah, you may blow up a front third member, and then on the trail you'll throw in your spare third, your spare welded 410 that you have, because you're a Toyota guy and you know how to do that, and you don't need to trailer it to the next garage and have some mechanic do it for you. Catch my drift? Like, if anyone's listening, like, do you get that? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if anyone's on the same page as me, but that's where I'm at. That's kind of what this podcast is going to be about. That's my wheeling experience, like right up until that point, and then everything from there is like at a level where everything's locked front and rear. Then you get into bigger tires, you need better axle shafts, like you need, you know, winches to go where you want to go. Then you start talking about, you know, coilovers and needing more articulation, you know, the limits of leaf springs and wheel hop, and which, like, there's hardly any limitations for a Toyota on leaf springs, let's be honest. But that's the kind of wheeling that I'm going to be talking about in these podcasts. Like, to me, real wheeling, not adventuring. Like all of that is fun and super awesome. Probably talk about that too, because I built my truck to be able to do that as well. But that's it. That's kind of how I built my truck up to that point, and then it, you know, got the real Trail Gear skid plate, and then I ended up taking off the funky rear box, and I built a custom flat deck for it, which was super, super awesome. And my truck was at a point where it was on 37s, locked front and rear. It was legit. It was decent on the street with 37 IROCs, bias plies. I had a box that would fit stuff for camping and like all my spares, and I could really do the best of both worlds. I could drive decent distances for like trail wheeling, and like more destination wheeling, and then I could still go in and do the hardcore trails if I want to do the hardcore trails. And it was kind of perfect of where I had my truck. And then my wife cheated on me and I got divorced. Well, actually, first, before that, very quickly, my wife was cheating on me, but was blaming everything on pretty much everything else. My truck was included in there, so I said, fine, I'll sell my truck. Like, this isn't worth our marriage, blah, blah, blah. And anyways, sold my truck, parted it out, didn't wheel, was totally out of the scene. And then I ended up finding out that she was cheating on me, so she was really just blaming all this other stuff because of her own guilt and was trying to make it my fault. Ended up getting divorced, and that sucked. I don't wish divorce on anyone, but that was shitty. And then I had no truck, and I kind of had to restart life. And on that time round, I was gonna make sure that whoever I was gonna marry or be in a relationship with was cool with me off-roading. And thank God I ended up meeting, my wife that I have now, who is fully in support. We have 2 kids, and when we had our first kid, we got married, and we're just kind of building building life back up to the point where it would make sense for me to get back into wheeling again. And when we were pregnant with our first kid, thank God no kids with the ex-wife. When we were pregnant with our first kid, I bought a 2-wheel drive Toyota pickup that was going to serve as Renault duty mule until I could build it. And that was 4 years ago. So our first kid is 4 years old, and I just finished my project a couple months ago, and kind of back into the wheeling scene, and loving every second of it. And that's why this podcast has started, because I'm quite literally right now driving to a client appointment a ways away, and might as well get this up and rolling, because I was looking for something that would be entertaining to listen to, specific to Toyota 4x4s. So that's that. I don't know if anyone's interested, but this is the beginnings, and enjoy your day. And I don't know if you can comment. Like, I still even need to figure out how to post this kind of stuff and start this podcast. But my YouTube is Miller Yoni, so MILLERJOUNI. My Instagram is JJOE_Miller, so at JJOE_Miller. And all my pictures of my current build are on there. And spread the word, man. Spread the word, woman, whoever's listening to this, because it'd be cool to have a Toyota 4x4 kind of specific podcast. And that's what I'm starting here. I got some great ideas to interview some people, some local 4x4 shops, and just have some fun conversation. For anyone that wants something other than music going on while they're working in their shop, on their truck, or on a road trip, or whatever. Enjoy. My name's Joe Miller. Peace.